Look, we need to stop pretending this is normal. Because what is unfolding around Rick Ross at this exact moment is not the usual rap news static, not a lazy Twitter dogpile, not another forgettable week of the internet clowning a big name for fun. This is louder than that. This is stranger than that. This is the sound of one of the most protected images in hip-hop finally getting stripped down to the studs while every camera on the internet zooms in for the close-up. And I am telling you, once you see what I am about to walk you through, you will never look at Rick Ross the same way again. Because the question people are whispering in every comment section right now is a question Rick Ross has spent almost 20 years engineering the world to never ask out loud. Was any of it ever real? Or has Rick Ross been running the world's most expensive magic trick in slow motion? That question is not a joke anymore. That question is a wildfire. Because in the span of what feels like a single nonstop humiliation cycle, bad optics stacking on bad optics, resurrected receipts, old rivals suddenly looking prophetic, viral clips that refuse to die, and one on-camera sentence that may go down as the most expensive quote of Rick Ross's career, Rick Ross has landed in the exact position a man like Rick Ross was never supposed to occupy. He looks reachable. He looks touchable. He looks small. Not calm, not aloof, not floating above the fray, small. And smallness is the one texture Rick Ross spent 2 decades convincing us he was physically incapable of wearing. Think about how fast this cracked. In a matter of weeks, Rick Ross has been filmed standing in a commercial terminal like everybody else in America. Rick Ross has watched his own jewelry get put on trial in real time after one throwaway punchline flipped into a genuine authenticity debate. Rick Ross has seen the old 50-cent playbook, the one that once branded him a fraud, get pulled off the shelf, dusted off, and quoted again by a whole new generation. Rick Ross has watched Drake fans keep his backstage humiliation looping on every platform like a highlight reel. Rick Ross has heard the name Officer Ricky trending in his comments again. Rick Ross has heard Freeway Ricky Ross's name resurface underneath his own. And then, right in the middle of that entire storm, Rick Ross sat on camera, got asked whether the internet's $150 million estimate of his fortune was real, and said, with a smile, that it was set in stone. That 5-word answer may cost Rick Ross more than any bad album ever could. Because the second you stamp a number on your own life in public, you are not flexing. You are handing the internet a ruler. You are telling every skeptic, every rival, every meme page, every comment archaeologist to measure everything Rick Ross does from that day forward against that number. And when the timing of that stamp lines up perfectly with the ugliest optics stretch of his career, you don't get a rollout anymore. You get a referendum. Let me be clear about what this really is, because a lot of people are misreading it. This is not a story about whether Rick Ross has money. Nobody with a functioning brain thinks Rick Ross is broke. This is a story about whether the character named Rick Ross, the untouchable Miami kingpin, the cigar-smoking boss above the boss, the man whose entire aesthetic promised that ordinary rules did not apply, is still a character anybody still believes in. Rick Ross built a persona out of scale. Rick Ross built a brand out of never being small. Rick Ross built an empire out of an idea, and the idea was that the idea itself was untouchable. And what you are watching right now is that idea getting tested in real time by an audience that finally stopped granting it the benefit of the doubt. That is why the online mood shifted from mockery to something colder. People used to laugh at Rick Ross. Now people are studying Rick Ross. And once an audience switches from laughing to studying, the artist is no longer running the story. The story is running the artist. Let's walk this out properly, because this collapse did not spring out of one bad afternoon. This is what happens when a decade of parked contradictions finally get triple parked in the same block. This is what happens when the mythology has to share the room with the archive, and the archive doesn't blink. Rick Ross has been depositing narrative IUS into the culture for years, and this is the week the culture cashed every last one of them. Start with the sentence itself. The one everybody keeps replaying. Because Rick Ross was doing what Rick Ross always does when a new album is loaded in the chamber. Big voice. Big jewelry. Big vocabulary of abundance. Rick Ross was rolling out his 12th studio album, and the packaging was pure Rick Ross fantasy. Wealth as texture, wealth as sound, wealth as atmosphere. Rick Ross has always understood something most rappers never grasp. He was never really selling songs. Rick Ross was selling weather. Pressing play on a Rick Ross album was supposed to feel like walking into a marble foyer in South Beach at 3 in the afternoon with the AC cranked to 62 degrees. That is the product. That has always been the product. And in the middle of that atmospheric rollout, an interviewer pulled up a phone, ran a search, and asked Rick Ross whether the $150 million figure floating online was accurate. Now, 10 out of 10 publicists in the free world would have prepped Rick Ross for that question with the same three-part answer. Laugh it off. Redirect to the album. Say the internet always inflates and deflates. Keep the number ambiguous. Ambiguity is the fortress. Ambiguity is what has kept every rapper's real net worth an open debate since the beginning of hip-hop. Ambiguity is the friend of legend. Rick Ross skipped ambiguity. Rick Ross grinned, leaned into his own album title like a man leaning into a punch, and told the interviewer the number was set in stone. That's it. That's the whole trap. Because the instant Rick Ross said that, the debate stopped being fuzzy and started being scored. Every airport clip suddenly had a scoreboard behind it. Every diamond suddenly had a magnifying glass held up to it. Every real estate video suddenly had a mortgage question hovering above it. And every old enemy, 50 Cent chief among them, suddenly had a fresh public benchmark to hammer at every time Rick Ross opened his mouth. It's not that Rick Ross said something untrue. It's that Rick Ross said something testable at the exact moment his own optics were the least ready to survive the test. And that is the point where the week really starts leaking. Because during that same rollout stretch, in the same general orbit of promo chatter, somebody complimented the way Rick Ross wears his ice. Softball. Free layup. All Rick Ross has to do is grin, drop a line about craftsmanship, name-check a jeweler, and reinforce the aesthetic. Instead, Rick Ross joked about knowing guys in Miami who deal in counterfeit stones. Rick Ross said it like a punchline. The room laughed. The conversation kept moving. But the internet, as always, does not keep moving. The internet freezes the frame. And within hours, the clip was flying not as comedy, but as evidence. Because the one accusation Rick Ross's entire brand cannot casually joke around is the accusation that the shine isn't shine. Rick Ross tried to walk it back afterward, framing it as clowning, insisting the watch in question was legitimate, and playing it like an off-camera aside that got weaponized. And maybe it was. But the damage was already sitting in every algorithm. Because doubt does not need a courtroom. Doubt does not need a verdict. Doubt only needs oxygen. And Rick Ross just handed it a tank. Once the audience starts silently asking whether some of Rick Ross's shine is real, every future Rick Ross visual stops landing at the same volume. Every future chain shot becomes a puzzle. Every future flex becomes a Rorschach. The image stops being unquestionable and starts being investigative. That is the shift you don't come back from easily. Not because it destroys the artist, because it re-educates the audience. Then came the airport footage. For a normal person, this would be nothing. Flying commercial is not a crime. Sitting in a terminal is not a scandal. Millions of people board planes every hour on this planet, and none of them get dragged for it. But Rick Ross is not a normal person selling a normal image. Rick Ross is a man who has spent nearly 2 decades building a mythology out of not being where regular people are. Bigger car, bigger chain, bigger house, bigger driveway, bigger everything. So when a video circulated of Rick Ross in an airport terminal, and the framing implied he was trying to move quietly, hood up, head low, the internet did not take it at face value. The internet turned it into philosophy. The clip stopped being a clip. The clip became a question. If Rick Ross is really the man he says he is, why does the boarding area look like this? If the jet lifestyle is set in stone, why is Rick Ross sharing air with a Cinnabon? Rick Ross, being Rick Ross, refused to let the moment breathe. Rick Ross flipped it into content, joked that his jet was in the shop, made a whole bit about how commercial flights were secretly a power move. And on paper that's smart. Turning a hit into a punchline is a real skill. But punchlines only work when the underlying story still stands. Once the audience is already suspicious, punchlines start sounding like improvisation. Once the audience is already suspicious, Comedy sounds like coping. That's the whole problem. Rick Ross was not defending the truth anymore. Rick Ross was defending an interpretation. And nobody in the history of image maintenance has ever won a defense war against interpretation. The internet doesn't run on truth. The internet runs on vibe. And the vibe was leaking. Now bring Drake into it, because this is where the wound turns from external to self-inflicted. If you have been anywhere near hip-hop for the last decade, you know the Rick Ross and Drake relationship used to be a partnership so lucrative it looked immune. Their records had chemistry that most collaborations only fake. Rick Ross once publicly named Drake as one of his favorite artists to record with. Their features shaped an entire era of luxury crossover rap. There was history there. There was money there. There was mutual polish there. And then the whole thing detonated. Once Drake fell out with Future and Metro Boomin, sides were drawn overnight. Rick Ross picked his lane loudly. Drake responded by pulling Rick Ross straight into the crossfire of the biggest rap feud of the modern era. Rick Ross hit back. Drake hit back. Kendrick Lamar walked in and turned the whole thing into a cultural earthquake. And when the smoke cleared, a lot of people felt Rick Ross had accidentally ended up on the winning side of history just by being anti-Drake at the right moment. That should have been the end of it for Rick Ross. Take the win. Go quiet. Sell the album. Wear the crown. Instead, Rick Ross kept talking. Rick Ross kept posting. Rick Ross kept dragging Drake back into every interview cycle, every promo run, every casual conversation that did not need a Drake mention shoehorned into it. And that is the point where the crowd stopped reading it as dominance and started reading it as fixation. Because fights are not scored by who lands more shots. Fights are scored by who looks like they need the fight more. And Rick Ross started looking like a man who could not let the fight end even after the audience had already handed him the trophy. Every time Rick Ross went back to the Drake well, the audience noticed a little more. Every jab at Drake's plane, every mock of Drake's rollouts, every reaction video Rick Ross posted about Drake's numbers, every time Rick Ross voluntarily let Drake headline his own press cycle, the mask cracked a millimeter more. Because a boss does not orbit somebody else's sun. A boss has his own gravity. And the audience is very good at spotting the difference between a man with his own gravity and a man borrowing yours. That is where the Drake story stopped serving Rick Ross and started slowly eating him. And this is the part that nobody around Rick Ross seems willing to say out loud. 12 albums deep. Legacy artist. Label boss. Businessman with real footprints. And a huge chunk of the promotional oxygen for his newest project got burned on another man's name. There is nothing that shrinks a persona faster than that. Rick Ross could have stood a foot taller by saying less. Rick Ross could have looked twice as heavy by looking half as bothered. That opportunity kept walking past him, and he kept turning his back on it. Then add 50 Cent back to the ledger, and the whole picture gets darker. Because 50 is not a normal rival. 50 is the single most surgical image saboteur rap has ever produced. 50 understands humiliation the way a chemist understands compounds. 50 does not just attack, 50 builds infrastructure around an attack. Give 50 one weakness and 50 will spend a decade turning it into a permanent brand. And Rick Ross gave 50 the infrastructure a long time ago. Ask Rick Ross now whether he and 50 have squashed anything, and Rick Ross basically says the peace treaty was never signed. Then Rick Ross runs the whole familiar attack package, critiques of 50's style, jabs at 50's ownership stakes, quips about 50's living situation, digs at 50's business record. Rick Ross tries to shrink 50 while enlarging himself. On paper, it's classic Rick Ross energy. But the paper doesn't matter because 50 has been sitting on a specific narrative weapon for years. The idea that when legal pressure once forced Rick Ross's actual financial paperwork into daylight, the paperwork did not match the rap. Whether that framing ever held up in a strict fact check is almost secondary. The meme of it has aged like uranium. It's radioactive. It lives in the culture. So every fresh Rick Ross optic, the airport, the jewelry joke, the $150 million stamp, does not enter a clean pond. It splashes into a pond already full of a decade of 50's coordinated fingerprints. That is the poisonous compound interest of narrative warfare. Whoever plants the seed first controls how every future crop tastes. Which drops us at the deepest cut of all, Officer Ricky. The ghost that never left the studio. Long before the airport clip, long before the jewelry punchline, long before the Drake orbit and the 50 revival, Rick Ross carried an original scar that a particular corner of hip-hop refuses to let heal. The gap between the mythology he sold and the pre-fame paperwork that surfaced. It has been rehashed so many times now that it's basically hip-hop folklore. Before Rick Ross became Rick Ross, William Roberts worked as a corrections officer. Photos surfaced. Denials were issued. Records confirmed. And the denial itself became the second scandal on top of the first. That sequence is the whole problem. Not the job. Not the record. Not the past. The handling of it. Because rappers survive uncomfortable pasts constantly. Nobody expects every artist to have been born inside the story they later tell. But when your entire brand is theatrical, larger than life, kingpin scale authority, the contrast between the paperwork and the persona becomes too clean, too dramatic, too easy for a rival to weaponize. That's why Officer Ricky stuck. That's why it never became background noise. It stuck because the cover-up stained harder than the underlying fact. In hip-hop, that ratio has always been true, and it will always be true. The audience will forgive a lot. What the audience will not forgive is the feeling that they were played. Layer on top of that the long-simmering discomfort around the very name Rick Ross. The association with Freeway Ricky Ross was never a coincidence, and the legal fight over that name only froze the discomfort in place for a whole new generation of listeners. Rick Ross won that court case. But winning a case is not the same thing as winning a conscience vote in the culture, and the culture never fully closed the file. That is why, in weeks like this one, the file always reopens itself. Here is what people miss about this whole conversation, though. Rick Ross is not some paper mogul who got exposed after 2 mixtapes. Rick Ross had genuine, undeniable, era-shaping success. Rick Ross made hits. Rick Ross made albums. Rick Ross made features that changed the ceiling for luxury rap. Rick Ross ran a label that broke real artists. Rick Ross built one of the most recognizable sonic identities of his generation. That grunt alone is a piece of hip-hop history. That's not up for debate. That's fact. And that is exactly why the current moment cuts so hard. Because the story of Rick Ross is not the story of a man who never built anything. It is the story of a man who built plenty and may now be watching a specific psychological layer of that build get slowly hollowed out from underneath him. That layer has a name. Belief. Not money, not property, not catalog, not Sonics. Belief. The audience's willingness to grant the persona the benefit of the doubt without demanding a receipt every time. Rick Ross feasted on that willingness for close to 20 years. And in the last few weeks, the audience has quietly started charging him rent on it. Look at the mansion content. For years, the sprawling estate footage was one of the most effective visual anchors in modern rap branding. Rick Ross on a riding mower. Rick Ross on his own acres. Rick Ross doing tours of the property like a king inspecting his territory. It was mythology maintenance. It was proof of life for the fantasy. And it worked. It really did work. But here is the paradox of visual proof. Once the surrounding image starts fracturing, the same images that used to sell the story start looking like they're trying to. What used to feel aspirational starts feeling defensive. What used to feel like flexing starts feeling like receipts you were legally required to produce. The mansion doesn't automatically save the jet story. The lawn footage doesn't automatically save the jewelry story. The scale of the property doesn't automatically save the authenticity question. And once the audience begins comparing symbol to symbol instead of accepting the composite package on faith, you are not selling a mythology anymore. You are answering an audit. Then came the physical moment nobody in the Rick Ross camp really has a good answer for. The backstage brush during the Not Like Us cultural storm. Regardless of what actually happened, once Rick Ross was publicly connected to a chaotic moment in Drake's orbit, his aura tore in a specific place a big rapper cannot afford tears. He looked reachable. He looked inside somebody else's chaos instead of untouchable outside of it. And rap audiences are ruthlessly, almost inhumanly sensitive to that specific texture. They will forgive a weak song. They will forgive a wild internet moment. What they will not forgive is a man whose brand is command showing up in a room where the command didn't belong to him. The perception space opened. And in the perception space, mythology dies fast. Because make no mistake about it, everything Rick Ross is fighting right now is a believability fight. Not a courtroom fight. Not a bank statement fight. Not even really a music fight. A story fight. Rick Ross once sold the story of Rick Ross better than almost anybody in the business. And the audience is now stress testing that story with a level of aggression Rick Ross has never had to survive before. Zoom out and the irony gets almost cinematic. Rick Ross is asking the audience to step into his luxury dream with set in stone while the internet is quietly running a completely different documentary in the next room. Rick Ross's version of the movie is still the boss, still the emperor, still the architect. The internet's version is a story about a character whose costume is beginning to weigh more than the character can carry. And every time Rick Ross opens his mouth to defend the version he wants us to see, he unintentionally hands the internet another line for the version they're already writing. I want to be fair here, because fairness is exactly what keeps this analysis honest. There is a lazy corner of this conversation that pretends Rick Ross is a total fraud with no accomplishments, no assets, no wins, and no substance. That framing is nonsense, and I don't respect it. Rick Ross has real credits. Rick Ross has real influence. Rick Ross has real business activity. Rick Ross has real cultural weight. Rick Ross is not a hologram. The real story is much more uncomfortable than that lazy framing, and it goes like this. Rick Ross may have built enough reality to prop up the persona for a very long time, but the persona itself became so oversized, so glossy, and so dependent on uninterrupted dominance that even minor slippage now looks catastrophic. Success didn't insulate Rick Ross. Success may have amplified his exposure. Because the taller you build the tower, the more spectacular the swaying looks when the wind finally arrives. And the wind has arrived from every direction at once. From the past, it is Officer Ricky, the Freeway Ricky Ross debate, and the fossil fuel deposits of denied authenticity. From the rivals, it is 50 Cent's slow drip infrastructure of doubt and Drake's mocking army of fans. From the optics, it is airport terminals, jewelry punchlines, tour chatter, and one very expensive sentence. From himself, it is the compulsive re-engagement, the inability to let a feud die, the compulsion to answer every jab, the addiction to being in every conversation. That last one is arguably the deadliest. Because in a moment like this, silence is the strongest currency a mogul has, and Rick Ross keeps spending it like it's monopoly money. Every response reads less like power and more like need. Every clapback confirms the sting. Every self-defense video reads as a receipt that the initial accusation actually landed. If Rick Ross truly moved at the altitude he says he does, the expected posture would be aloofness, the I don't even need to answer this energy that legends have historically wielded like body armor. Instead, Rick Ross is everywhere, on every timeline, chasing every mention, and the internet is silently updating its diagnosis in real time. That is why the $150 million sentence is such a gift to critics. Not because it proves he has that number or doesn't. Because it locked Rick Ross into a testable version of himself at the exact moment the audience wanted to test him most. Rick Ross could have laughed it off. Rick Ross could have declined. Rick Ross could have kept it vague, and the ambiguity would have quietly protected him. Instead, he stamped it. Now every clip is a court exhibit. Every flex is a data point. Every future line is scored against that number. That is what people mean when they say Rick Ross scored on his own goal. There is a specific Rick Ross that always worked, and I want to name it because the contrast is instructive. The best Rick Ross is the version whose opulence is atmospheric, not defensive. The version whose voice is so textured, so certain, so wrapped in gravitas, that you don't feel the urge to interrogate the flex. You just want to be inside the room he's describing. That Rick Ross doesn't have to prove the wealth. That Rick Ross doesn't have to answer the airport clip. That Rick Ross just is, and the audience relaxes into the mythology. But the second Rick Ross enters explanation mode, the magic thins. The curtain moves an inch. The gears become audible. And once the gears become audible, the audience starts asking how much of the show was always staging in the first place. Every artist stages. Every persona is partial theater. But Rick Ross's persona relies more heavily than most on the audience not noticing the theater. That is the load-bearing wall of the whole architecture. And the audience just started noticing. That is why this stretch is bigger than any single receipt. It is not really about whether a watch is real. It is not really about whether a flight was booked commercial. It is not really about whether a feud went on too long. Those are symptoms. The disease underneath all of them is doubt. And doubt spreads faster online than anything else in the human condition. Doubt turns every old clip into new evidence. Doubt makes the fans quieter and the enemies louder. Doubt rewrites the past in the audience's memory without anybody asking permission. If they want to believe Rick Ross is still a heavyweight mogul, the estate videos still say that. If they want to believe Rick Ross is compensating, those same estate videos now say that. That is what brand collapse actually looks like. Not truth flipping. Interpretation flipping. Rick Ross used to own the interpretation. That is what a real image is, ownership of interpretation. The audience does not get to decide what Rick Ross means. Rick Ross gets to decide what Rick Ross means. That was the whole game. That is what he lost in the last 30 days. He lost the deed to his own image, and the internet moved in without paying for it. And the internet, when it senses a superstar who cannot stop feeding it, becomes crueler than any rival. Because now the algorithm has flavor. The algorithm has tempo. The algorithm has receipts stacked in a pattern it can predict. And once the algorithm can predict you, the algorithm can farm you. And once the algorithm can farm you, you are not a mogul on the timeline anymore. You are content. Now let's talk about legacy, because this is where the story actually matters beyond gossip. Rick Ross's legacy, in theory, should be locked. Rick Ross has catalog. Rick Ross has a voice that is instantly identifiable in one syllable. Rick Ross has an era on his resume. Rick Ross has business receipts. Rick Ross has fingerprints on careers around him. Rick Ross took Southern luxury rap and gave it a specific cinematic weight it had never quite had before. Those are not small accomplishments, and they don't evaporate because of a bad month. But legacy is not just accomplishments. Legacy is the feeling people carry when they say your name a decade later. And feelings can absolutely be damaged even when facts cannot. Rick Ross did not have to keep every feud on drip. Rick Ross did not have to answer every troll. Rick Ross did not have to make every rollout partly about somebody else. Rick Ross did not have to leave old wounds like Officer Ricky untreated for so long that they became permanent scars. Rick Ross did not have to stamp a number on his own life during the worst possible perception window. Those were choices. And the audience is judging the choices with the same intensity it once used to celebrate the songs. That is why so many people are quietly saying Rick Ross may have damaged his own legacy. Not erased, damaged. Those are two different verbs. You cannot delete the catalog. You can absolutely dim the way it glows in the culture's memory. And if you are a real Rick Ross supporter, the saddest reading of all this is that there was always another version of the story available. There was a Rick Ross who could have taken his shots in the Drake War, gone quiet, and let the culture crown him by default. There was a Rick Ross who could have owned Officer Ricky 10 years earlier and defamed it permanently. There was a Rick Ross who could have let the mansion, the label, the discography, the collaborations, and the atmosphere speak for themselves. There was a Rick Ross who could have treated the internet like weather instead of a battlefield. That Rick Ross would look inevitable today. That Rick Ross would look enormous today. That Rick Ross would look bulletproof today. The Rick Ross we actually got is louder and simultaneously smaller, the deadliest combination in the entertainment business. Because volume without altitude reads as panic. And panic is the opposite of the entire aesthetic Rick Ross ever tried to sell. Let me give you the harshest truth in the whole conversation. The Rick Ross brand was built on a promise that is almost mathematically impossible to keep as audiences age and get sharper. The promise was, I am bigger than you, and I am proof that bigger is possible. That worked spectacularly for a long time. But every year the persona ages, the maintenance cost climbs. Eventually, the audience starts wondering whether the fantasy is still growing or whether it's on a loop. Eventually, the audience starts noticing when the same flex has to do more emotional work than it used to. Eventually, the audience starts asking whether the authority is still coming from reality or from muscle memory. Rick Ross may have crossed that eventual threshold. And if he has, the answer is not more explanation. The answer is reinvention or radical silence or a genuinely undeniable album or, honestly, all three at once. Every unnecessary Drake mention shrinks him. Every recycled 50 clapback shrinks him. Every overconfident boss line that hands the meme accounts an easy layup shrinks him. Every attempt to outstory his own credibility problem shrinks him a little more. The internet is telling Rick Ross very clearly that it no longer wants the same script from him without harder proof. And maybe that is really what Set in Stone is up against. Not sales. Not reviews. Not playlist ads. Believability. If the album lands undeniably, the noise cools. If the album lands as another atmospheric Rick Ross record without a new edge, the criticism will drown the atmosphere. Because once a rollout turns into a referendum, the album stops being an album. It becomes testimony. Either Exhibit A for the defense or Exhibit A for the prosecution. And zoomed all the way out, this is a story about more than Rick Ross. This is a story about the shelf life of any persona that sells itself as bigger than any real human life can sustain. Because eventually life supplies contradiction. Eventually the camera catches the wrong angle. Eventually a rival plants the perfect line at the perfect moment. Eventually an old chapter refuses to stay buried. Eventually the mythology has to share the room with the archive, and the archive does not blink. Rick Ross is not the first artist to hit this wall, and he will not be the last. But he may be the clearest example in modern hip-hop of what happens when a man tries to outtalk his archive instead of outgrowing it. The receipts don't blink. The receipts don't lose their patience. The receipts don't age out of relevance. The receipts just sit there, waiting to be reread. That is why this feels different. This is not a normal hater cycle. This is the audience quietly deciding it is done taking the Rick Ross image at face value. That doesn't mean every rumor is right. That doesn't mean every joke is fair. That doesn't mean Rick Ross has no money, no relevance, no history. It means the burden of proof has shifted, and once the burden of proof shifts onto the artist himself, the artist is already losing a certain kind of fight. Legends should never be asked to explain the costume while they are still wearing it. So where does that leave Rick Ross? It leaves Rick Ross with real history and real weight and a rollout unfolding under a cloud that will not lift on schedule. It leaves Rick Ross with rivals looking newly correct to fans who once dismissed them. It leaves Rick Ross with a public that no longer treats him like a myth and now treats him like an ongoing debate. And it leaves Rick Ross with the question he accidentally forced onto himself the second he said the number was set in stone. If the number is really that solid, why does everything around it look this fragile? Because flying commercial isn't shameful. One jewelry joke isn't a confession. Rival fans aren't objective judges. But image-driven artists live and die on alignment, the alignment between what they say and what the audience thinks it sees. Right now, for a huge segment of that audience, the alignment is broken. And once the audience finds a broken thread, they don't stop at the thread. They pull until they find out whether the whole outfit was ever stitched together in the first place. Rick Ross keeps pulling from the other side. That almost never ends where the mogul wants it to end. Maybe Rick Ross proves us all wrong. Maybe the album detonates. Maybe the businesses keep running. Maybe the public gets bored, moves on, and the storm evaporates in a month. That's possible. The internet has the memory of a goldfish some weeks. But even if the storm passes, a specific piece of damage may already be permanent. Because once a certain flavor of doubt gets into a mogul's brand, it doesn't fully leave. The invincibility is gone. The automatic benefit of the doubt is gone. The presumption of legend is gone. And when those things quietly walk out of the room, the artist doesn't disappear, but the way the culture talks about that artist rewires forever. That is what legacy damage actually looks like. Not deletion. Reduction. So the real question is no longer whether Rick Ross is finished. The real question is whether the version of Rick Ross the world believed in for 2 decades is finished. Because those are two very different men. One can keep making money, keep making music, keep buying land, keep signing deals, and still lose the one specific thing that made the whole package feel enormous. Belief. And once belief walks out, every prop in the collection starts looking like a prop. That is the fear no one who built a persona on scale ever wants to face. And that may be exactly the fear Rick Ross is staring at right now. So I want to hear you. Did Rick Ross actually damage his own legacy with the way he handled all of this? Or is the internet just doing what the internet always does, turning a rough month into a full collapse narrative because collapse is more entertaining than nuance? Do you think the airport clip actually matters, or was the reaction bigger than the moment? Do you think the jewelry punchline did real damage, or was it a nothing burger inflated by rivals? Do you think Rick Ross kept the Drake feud alive way past its expiration date? Do you think 50 Cent has been quietly winning the long game against Rick Ross for a decade and everyone is only now catching up? Do you think Officer Ricky is still the deepest scar in the whole story? And when Rick Ross said the $150 million number was set in stone, was that a boss move or the most expensive sentence of his career? Most importantly, do you think set in stone rescues Rick Ross from this stretch, or has too much already leaked for any album to close the wound? Give me the real read in the comments. Don't sugarcoat it. I want the unfiltered answer. Did Rick Ross get clowned unfairly, or did the mask finally slip? If this breakdown gave you a new angle on what's happening, hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already locked in, and send this video to the person in your group chat who still swears Rick Ross is going to walk through this untouched. Because whether you love Rick Ross, doubt Rick Ross, or think this whole conversation is overblown, one thing is now impossible to argue. Rick Ross is no longer moving through this chapter untouched. And the second the culture sees a mogul get touched, the story about that mogul is never told the same way again. I'll see you in the next one.